G'day, it's Paul Rowe. This morning I was reading Jesus' little story about the seed. And he said, that tiny seed can produce a huge tree just like my kingdom. And it's amazing, isn't it, that in that little tiny seed there's a whole DNA program that's going to produce just that thing. It's one of the miracles in the world, isn't it? And I've learnt the same thing with people, that people's lives, only tiny lives, but somehow that tiny life can sort of grow to be something bigger than itself almost. When I was working on the Outback History Centre called the Backer Burke Centre, I was the historian there and I was writing script for it. And I decided I was going to tell the big story of the northwest of New South Wales and the Outback, and they were very big stories, but to tell them through telling individual stories, small stories. And the reason I did that was, well, two things. One, when I first came to Burke, I got involved in the local radio station interviewing old timers, and at first I thought, interviewing old timers, okay. But as I interviewed one after another of these very interesting people who'd done quite astonishing things, I was growing in my understanding of what really the history of Australia was about. It was my apprenticeship, and those people with what they would have considered just ordinary lives had done some pretty extraordinary things. And when you put them all together and you told those stories on air, people began to see a different picture and understood a big picture about themselves. And then visitors who came to town began to see a bigger picture of Australia too. The second thing was when I went to America in 2000, and we visited a whole lot of museums there. But one place I went was to Florentine Films in Vermont. And I met two historians there who'd worked on a very famous award-winning series called The West, and another one on the Civil War with a documentary maker called Ken Burns. And they told me, when we sat together one afternoon, they said, we decided we were going to tell the big story of the Civil War, or the big story of the West, by tracking this life here along and this life here along till they met. And then, as Ken Burns put it, there's a 1 + 1 = 3 effect. Something bigger happens when you bring those small lives together, and a chemistry happens that opens up a much bigger story. So when I got involved in writing the stories for Burke, I found here I was able to tell not just the story of little old Burke, a little town on the edge of the Outback, but these stories were actually reaching wider and wider right across the state and then eventually across the country, because somebody like Henry Lawson or whoever, they were writing things about the mateship ethic, and another historian who came to town, C.W. Bean, he wrote the Anzac story eventually. So it's amazing, isn't it, how small lives can add up to making a much bigger picture. In fact, somebody said about C.W. Bean, who wrote the war history, he made the Anzacs more significant by making them ordinary. I like that. Well, I decided to do something similar, and just recently I thought I'll tell the story of Frankfaulkner. When I went to Burke, I met, particularly from the Aboriginal people, they talk about Brother Frank. And I saw him once or twice. He was just a little man, had a truck, with fruit and vegetables, wore sand shoes and braces. Just a quiet man, humble man. But the beautiful thing about Frank, as I heard his story gradually pieced together, he'd quietly give out these fruit, a lot of it to the Aboriginal people, kids. His business didn't, his business didn't do all that well because he gave a lot away. But he also sustained some key leaders in the town. Bill Reid, who was a very active member of the civil rights movement, he was supported by Frankfaulkner, the little church that Bill preached in, built by Frankfaulkner. Old Mungadai, full-blood Aboriginal, who used to stand in the main street telling people his story about how his people had been massacred out in the northwest corner of New South Wales, but how Jesus had changed his life and enabled him to forgive. Well, it's a powerful thing. And then the Doolan family, who he helped settle in Burke, they went on to have a very strong influence on education, particularly for Indigenous kids right through the West. So one man with a heart for people, who gave everything he had to it and did it quietly without fanfare. I don't know if it got a headline. But Frankfaulkner of Burke, I wonder one day whether his story will shine and we'll see it for what it was really worth, that investment that he made. Somebody wrote a poem about him, I like it. It's just a simple poem. It said, each Sunday you could see him in his colourful Chev 4, loaded up with children, the children of the poor. The small dark ones around the truck will not forget his kindness, for this good old man is only one in the world so full of blindness. Frankfaulkner. You can tell the big story through the little story. And you probably know people like Frank who made a difference where they were with what they had. And you might like to tell their story. That's all I do. I'm the Outback historian. I'll catch you down the track.